violence and ethics is what I spend my waking hours thinking about, and I tend to focus at the moment on new technologies, drone technologies, autonomous weapons, and specifically AI-enabled autonomous weapons. And I want to echo one of the calls that I had earlier, that resistance is not futile. And I do agree. I think reclaiming our own agency is really important. So as a political theorist, I'm interested in looking critically at our own relationship to technology or with technology, and how this might shape our ability to think and act politically and think and act ethically. So I'm interested in what happens to our political and ethical agency in a technologically mediated present. So in what ways do these technological rationales and also the scientific rationales and apparatuses within which we use, in what ways do they guide what we know, so our knowledge, what we want, our desires, and what ways do they guide our practices and our justifications? And this is interesting to me in a mundane, everyday context, but also very much so in the context of warfare, of course. Because I argue that our technologies have a capacity to shape our modes of governance, our security practices, and again, our justifications of violence. So understanding what's going on there is really what I'm concerned with. What sort of assumptions are produced and reproduced. So here, I'm not so much concerned about what we do with autonomous weapon systems or AI, but the other way around, I'm concerned with what does AI or autonomous weapon systems do with us. And I've always been quite puzzled by the fact that violence enacted with technologically sophisticated modes is apparently more easily justified. And my research so far has focused on drone warfare and the modes with which technology facilitates justifications of violence and the ethical framing of violence, right? We've seen this with drone warfare, that it was posited that it is a more ethical way of waging war than conventional modes of warfare, some advocates suggest. So what I'm concerned then with is how the availability of certain technologies of violence shape moral decisions or considerations in ways that are not making us less violent or better moral agents, but quite the contrary. And so in our contemporary context, three things strike me as important, and I will only have time to unpack one of them. But first and foremost, it strikes me that the more complex and autonomous the technological interfaces are with which we wage war, the more prominently is ethics reduced to merely a technical issue or a technical analysis. Ethics is thus seen as a set of constraints that needs to be solved. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of those reasons being that the people who make technology are not ethicists. So when they think about ethics, they think about ethics in a technological way as a set of constraints that needs to be solved, an engineering problem. To me, this is highly problematic, and I've unpacked this a little bit. The second thing that seems to happen is that the focus shifts in the discussions, in the debates on autonomous weapons systems in particular, also on the debates on autonomous cars, for example. The focus shifts on killing or death as a primary mode through which right and wrong is calculated in some ways. So not whether or not to kill in the first place, but how to best kill or who to best kill in some ways. So this is a weird thing that happens where this focus on death is kind of highlighted and sort of treated as something rather unproblematic. There's another issue with some sometimes confused conceptions of what war actually is. Is it war between two states? Is it war that needs to have a swift end? Is it a technological, very professional, clean war? So in the current debates, there's a number of ethically relevant viewpoints that are somewhat confused, but the focus really is on ethics as techniques and on killing as a primary lens here. And so the suggestion that I make is that overall our ability to think ethically atrophies, it shrinks, it diminishes, the more we have the capacity to outsource morally relevant decision to technology. Ethics is really complex. Ethics of war is even more complex. And the way we're thinking about it is a little bit reductionist for my liking, to be honest with you. Usually it involves multiple conflicting choices. It involves dilemmas. It involves something that often doesn't have a solution at all, but rather ethics demands that we make a choice, an uncomfortable choice. But from this choice then emerges a moral responsibility, or a responsibility in the first place. And so the less we're willing to submit ourselves to these uncomfortable moments where there isn't a clear solution, and in which we can be held, or we have to be held morally responsible, the less skilled we become as moral agents. So you get the sense I'm really concerned with our own moral agency and our own ability to think through ideas of ethics. And I think we should take that condition very seriously. And it begins for me by accepting that, and bear with me here, that material objects, our technologies, are not always just tools that we use at our leisure, or that we direct, that we channel for our willful engagement. But technology, and especially digital technology today, has the ability to shape us in unforeseen ways, to produce ways of thinking, to normalize practices, and so on and so forth. I point you no further than your own use of your smartphone, if you should have one. And you will know that this little red dot on your smartphone will have produced desires and attention economies that were previously, you didn't know that you needed to answer that text. You didn't know that you needed to respond, or that you were longing for somebody to respond to your WhatsApp message, etc. Right? So there's an interface issue here by which technologies produce expectations and practices that previously weren't necessarily on the horizon. And that couldn't have been foreseen either. So what this perspective allows us to recognize is that our own agency works in a dynamic interplay with our environment and with the technologies that we produce. We act and work in relation to one another as humans, but also in relation to our own technologies. So I want to take this situatedness, this being within, embedded with technological artifacts that make a demand on us and to which we respond. I want to take that seriously. And that's sort of unpacking a certain dimension of that in my book as well. And specifically here, in the last few minutes that I have, I'm concerned that the technologies that we have, warfare technologies, and to which, and this is important, to which we ascribe superhuman qualities, right? Our machineries today are much better than humans. They have better cognitive abilities. They don't need to sleep. They can see better. They can compute faster, etc. So these technologies to which we ascribe superhuman qualities in terms of scope of action, etc., shape our ways of thinking ethically and politically also towards a very specific technological logic of what is right and wrong. So a technological logic of ethics, in which ethics, also politics, but I'm just focusing on ethics today, becomes nothing or rarely or barely something more than a mathematically ascertainable and solvable category. Moreover, then, with greater levels of decision-making for human contexts being delegated to the machine, again in the interest of speed, optimization, and strategic advantage, so the human capacity for understanding the context within which these technologies work shrinks, of course, is diminished. And so our knowledge about warfare contexts atrophies in that sense. And we've heard in the drone session a little bit about automation bias, and this is really where it becomes kind of complex. So where there's an ever greater trust placed in machine authority, because it's faster, it's better, it's speedier, it's more greater in optimizing. This truncates experiential and situated knowledge, which is required for making an ethical decision in warfare. And it gives priority to discrete numbers. It gives priority to data. And we have this very much with deliberating the permissibility of harm to civilians, right? How many people are you allowed to include in your collateral damage estimations for this to still be an ethical decision, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a growing fixation with data, the bigger the better, and that reflects this priority as such. And for this, and specifically with lethal autonomous technologies, the technologies then serve as a professional veneer, if you will, for violent acts that might otherwise, based on data, lots of data, more data than we can possibly comprehend or compute, it serves as a veneer for these violent acts that otherwise might be perceived as wrong. And Nisha Crawford, a great scholar, wrote about this, the long history of technology and the role of technology in warfare. And she says that technical analysis, but also technical acts in this context, really smooth over the moral responsibility for action. And it produces or it enables moral blind spots. And in contemporary parlance, we would call this tech washing, if you will. So the focus on thinking about morality in sort of scientific numerical terms also facilitates giving technology a moral authority itself, and again risks de-skilling and desensitizing operators and decision makers, desensitizing them to morally difficult situations where there isn't an obvious solution. Again, in these contexts, inflicting harm, causing violence, becomes a math problem. But that, of course, then leaves aside everything which cannot be captured as data. Right? You can then only ethically consider all those things that are computable, that can be captured in discrete numbers. But we do know that relations cannot necessarily be attributed with a number. They're not interpersonal relations or relational categories are not necessarily mathematical categories. So that which cannot be captured in discrete numerical terms, the data points, has to be left outside, and where people and their lives become nothing more than data points. The non-data elements, the embodied elements, the sensory stuff that doesn't have a number, or that can't be computed into frameworks relevant to ascertaining a solution, they become sidelined or they become hidden. Again, this is the issue with moral blind spots. And the way we're thinking about autonomous weapon systems, lethal autonomous weapon systems, is usually framed, the debates are usually framed in terms of rational choices or rational frameworks, consequentialist frameworks, or rule-based type of frameworks. Again, that works with the technological focus or the technological logic, but it leaves aside a whole lot of other things. And that this kind of thinking is becoming mainstream is to me, it's quite evident in all the, when I follow the debates, but also with, I don't know if you read this article or whether you're familiar with the MIT moral machine interface, where it was an experiment designed where people could visit the MIT moral machine webpage. The issue was autonomous cars, where people all over the globe could participate in making a choice whether in specific given scenarios the autonomous car should kill the pedestrians or sacrifice the passengers, should kill older people over younger people, etc. Right? So there was a number of binary choices that everybody could sort of submit their choice with the idea that we can figure out what is morally acceptable through crowdsourcing in some ways or another. That is an extremely reductionist way of thinking about ethics. It is also an extremely reductionist way of thinking about violence or killing people or causing death or even causing harm. And especially for ethics and especially for war, and this is my urging to everybody, we have to think about these. I think we heard it earlier in the drone session, the second one. These are relational problems. These are social problems. These are not technological problems. And the more we think these are just purely computable issues that we can solve, if only we had all the data points we need, the more we risk that we're increasing violence rather than limiting violence. And that's in the nature of violence itself, but I don't have time to unpack this as such. So violence enacted through technology can't necessarily have these moral or ethical dimensions that it is bestowed with, because it completely precludes, or not completely, but to a certain degree precludes a peace paradigm. So my final call is really, and I'm thinking this through a little bit, because I'm working and I'm thinking through technology, but technology and ethics seem to be not talking to each other. There's not the right vocabulary. But for some reason, we seem to be very willing to become extremely sophisticated with our technologies. And in turn, we become very limited with our ways of thinking about ethics. And I would encourage us to become more agile and more dynamic thinkers about ethics, and be as conscientious in finding ways to think through ethical issues, issues of more relevance, taking more responsibility as we do in developing technological solution. I have this roughly sketched out framework where I mobilize a technological language, dumb algorithms versus smart algorithms. I want to posit that we're moving within the framework of dumb ethics and we should move to smart ethics, but I haven't really worked that out properly yet, so I'm just going to leave it here and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.